This week's Dark Side of the Ring was the season finale on Black Saturday, The Rise of Vince McMahon. We have the rise of Vince McMahon, and this year we have the fall of Vince McMahon. This was similar to the John Tenta episode, in that there wasn't a whole lot about it that I would call dark, but if you are into backstage power plays and the politics and the dirty underbelly of the wrestling business, then this is the episode for you. Black Saturday is an event that actually really ended up having a huge impact on the wrestling business. But to understand it, we have to go back to a time where wrestling fans knew Vince McMahon Jr. as the announcer guy on TV. That's what he was to me when I first started watching WWE. He was the announcer guy. I even had his LJN figure. He had the red jacket and some blue trim on there. That was me. I wanted to be the next Mean Gene Okerlund. So I thought, hey, I'll buy the announcer figures. I had Vince and I had Mean Gene. I don't think they ever made a Sean Mooney one, but if they did, I probably would have bought it. But in wrestling, everybody knew him as the son of Vince Sr., who had just bought the company from his dad. That was in '82. And it wasn't a case where Vince, inherited, a struggling company and turned it around and turned it into this big booming business. He did, but he inherited a very successful, very strong, very profitable company from his father. And he just went on to blow it up even bigger. But it's not as if he had to struggle very much, like he was starting his own promotion from scratch. That would make for a better story. Jim Cornette was back as the resident historian in this, as was Dave Meltzer. Gerald Briscoe, who was the only living shareholder still around outside of Vince himself, who was able to talk about the Georgia Championship Wrestling stuff, Briscoe was. Ole Anderson, who was a big part of the episode, he is still alive, or I should say he was when this was filmed, but he was in very poor health at the time with MS. So they interviewed his oldest son, Bryant, who sounds exactly like his father. Like, there is no doubt which gene pool he was doing backstrokes in. Bob Roop, another former wrestler, he was also interviewed. Roop looks and sounds exactly like Ole. Like, it is scary. To the point where when they first showed him on screen, I thought it was Ole himself. Or his long-lost brother. Bob Roop looks more like Ole than Ole's own son does. They interviewed Wildfire Tommy Rich, one of the all-time great baby faces, former referee Nick Patrick, and a couple of Georgia Championship Wrestling employees that they tracked down. Bobby Simmons, who used to set up the ring, among other things, and Louise Cochran, who worked in the office. Back then, the NWA, it was the governing body of all the territories. Today, the NWA is a promotion. It has no power. It barely has a presence of its own. I can't even call it a shell of what it used to be, because what it is today is not anything like what it used to be. But they would always have an annual meeting of all the promoters, and they looked at Vince Jr. as this kid. They didn't think much of him. But let's talk about Jim Barnett, another hugely influential figure in the wrestling industry, and someone who was a key figure in this episode. Good old James E. Barnett. Now you know where the James E. Cornette name came from when Cornette came to the WWF. It was a rib on Barnett. So just to give you some backstory, Barnett was a promoter, and a very successful one, inside and outside the United States. I know he ran things in Australia for a while, did big business there. He ran New Zealand before he ultimately came back to the United States. And he ended up running the Georgia territory as well during a period where Georgia was doing big business. And he is someone who had a lot of friends in high places. He had a lot of connections with politicians and judges and the local police department, which is why he was able to keep the State Athletic Commission out of wrestling for so long. He had friends even all the way up to the President of the United States. After Jimmy Carter was elected president, he nominated Jim Barnett, who was also a big campaign contributor of his, to a spot on the National Council on the Arts. He was big into the arts. And that wasn't the only thing that he was rumored to be big into. And you can never be sure, but, he was an openly gay man in an industry that back then was not very tolerant of people like that. But he was successful. And if you were successful and you can make money or draw money, like Pat Patterson did, then the industry was a lot more accepting of you. But there was also a lot of stories about Jim Barnett and his proclivities. And that is something that they did not get into here on this Dark Side episode, was the dark side of Jim Barnett. You could do an entire episode just based on the Kentucky football scandal, which is documented. It's in a book called The Thin 30. And I don't know when I may get to talk about Jim Barnett again, and I found this to be fascinating. So we'll talk about it now. But the book talks about at the time, the new Kentucky football coach in 1962 at the college there, who would put his players through some of the most brutal training that you could imagine. And the squad went from 88 players all the way down to 30. That's why it's called the Thin 30. And not only did those players have to survive a tough season on the field, there were sex scandals and gambling scandals that the book talks about. And one of those sex scandals involved Mr. Barnett and Rock Hudson. Now, Rock Hudson is one of the most famous movie stars of all time, also a gay man, which was an open secret within the film industry. It was not something he wanted, though, to be well known publicly, for fear that it would ruin his career. And he was outed publicly only a few months before he was diagnosed with AIDS, and then he died in 1985. But there's a whole chapter in the book called Predators in Their Midst. Shout out to Mike Mooneyham, who did a whole column about this back in 2007. The book documents a 3-year period where Barnett, this I think was late 50s into the early 60s, where Barnett supposedly provided members of the college football team with a lot of perks in exchange for sexual favors. And he had a really nice house, very lavish, and that house became a place off campus for players to hang out and do whatever they were doing at that house. Rock Hudson became a regular visitor of Barnett's home. He would throw these really extravagant parties for the football players and plenty of food and liquor. Hudson would even invite some of the players to come over, which, if you got a big movie star like Rock Hudson inviting you to come over for a party, you're not going to say no. The coach eventually put an end to what was going on for fear that it would cause a major scandal, because the school had already been rocked by a point-shaving scandal years before. So if a sex scandal came out, that could be the end of the football program. And almost overnight, Barnett and his partner, they left town, and they took their wrestling promotion to Australia. He didn't just leave Kentucky, he left the country. And he ended up overseeing this big boom period for wrestling in Australia back in the 1960s. Then he worked with Ted Turner in the 70s to bring Georgia Championship Wrestling to the Superstation, TBS, which brought pro wrestling to cable TV for the very first time, blew the doors wide open as far as bringing the product to a national audience. So when I tell you that Jim Barnett was an influential figure in the wrestling industry, you can see why. In that way, he was Vince McMahon before Vince McMahon, with his vision of taking wrestling national. That's what Barnett did. He took a local promotion and he got it exposure in a lot of other markets. Now, Cornette, in the episode, he says that Barnett was cutthroat behind the scenes. He was the kind of guy who would cut your balls off and shove them down your throat, and you would thank him for it. Ole Anderson was not only a wrestler, he was in charge of matchmaking for GCW. Ole bought into the Georgia territory. This was early in his career. So did Jerry Briscoe. So did his brother Jack. By 1982, business had fallen. And Ole starts to question where the money was going. He knew they were skimming a little bit of money off the top, to pay off politicians and other important people. But the numbers just weren't making any sense. Back then, you did not question Jim Barnett, but Ole did. He was wondering if some of that money, maybe that should have been going elsewhere, was actually going into his pocket. So Barnett had taken out, and I don't know that people knew this at the time, but Barnett had taken out multiple loans with different banks and institutions to try to keep the company afloat. He even sold much of his own stock, not only in Georgia, but other territories, because he had stock in Florida. He sold it to an old college friend of his named Jim Oates. But one day, Barnett, he flies to Asia to buy some new suits. I guess he was a man of fashion. While he was away, Ole broke into his office and got to the books. And this shit was under lock and key, but he got to the books. And he saw that Barnett was spending like crazy. He was spending $3,000 a month on phone bills. He was spending money on a personal driver. He had a personal chef. And this is where a lot of the money was going. It was going to local politicians and TV station owners and arena owners also, but you had these other expenditures that nobody knew about. And the promotion was like $300,000 in debt. So Ole tries to convince people that Barnett was embezzling money. And what happened is he called a secret meeting of all the other stockholders, and then he went to Barnett. Not only did he threaten to beat the shit out of him and toss him off of a balcony, he threatened to turn him into the cops for embezzlement if he didn't agree to give up his position as the president of the territory. Now, threatening to beat the shit out of somebody and then also threatening to go to the cops, that doesn't really sound like the best idea. Probably, pick one lane and stick to it. So they negotiated back and forth. Barnett didn't want his image to be tarnished. He didn't want this to come out. So they negotiated back and forth on the terms of his surrender, basically, and in the end, he gave up his power. But as powerful as he was, you had to know that he would get his revenge at some point. He wasn't going to take this lying down. So now he's been kicked out. Barnett sells his remaining percentage of the company to his old friend, Jim Oates. Later that same year, Jim Barnett gets a new job, working for Vince McMahon as the chief operating officer of Titan Sports. And that brings us to the annual NWA convention in 1983, where Vince Sr., Vince Jr., and Barnett blindsided everybody, and they all resigned from the NWA. And in the episode, Cornette says that can only mean one of two things. Either you're getting out of the wrestling business completely, which they weren't, or they are now going to compete with the NWA. And Ole knew what it meant. They were going to sabotage Georgia. And they did. Not only Georgia, but other territories as well. I've told the stories before of Vince showing up with a briefcase full of money to local TV stations in different territories and offering the station manager $2,000 a week if they would air tapes of the WWF show and not the local promotion. And most of the stations took the money because a lot of that was a lot of money back then, number one. And number two, the stations didn't have signed contracts with any of these other promotions. Today you have signed contracts. You have binding contracts. Back then, there were no written agreements about a lot of this stuff. Maybe it was a handshake and that was it. There was nothing in writing. And not only that, weird things started happening where, in the territory, buildings that these, that they would run no longer were allowing them to run there. Or in the middle of a show, the cops would randomly show up to arrest certain wrestlers for selling drugs off of an anonymous tip that they got. And Ole's son says, he never had any proof, but it's awfully suspicious how these things started happening once Vince set off his plans for, basically world domination. So Vince ended up getting the time slot on the USA Network from Southwest Championship Wrestling. That was the beginning of their relationship with USA. Southwest couldn't afford the slot anymore, and so Vince got the spot, and that's when All American Wrestling debuted on USA. And he told promoters, now look, I got a national show. You can send me your tapes, and I'll help get your guys more exposure and help get them over. But he didn't give a shit about that. It was all part of his plan. He wanted to sign those top stars to come work for him. And that's what he did. If you look at who he built his national expansion off the backs of, it was all the guys he took from other places who were already over. Hulk Hogan was like the crown jewel. He was the biggest one. But he absolutely raided the AWA. Look at all the guys he got just from that one territory. Including Hogan, by the way. Hogan and Gene Okerlund and Bobby Heenan and Ventura and so many different guys. Vince would offer signing bonuses to people, not only to leave their territory, but to no-show that promotion's events without telling anybody. The same shit he tried to pull on UFC years ago when he tried to bring Mike Goldberg in to replace Jim Ross as his lead announcer on Monday Night Raw. He was still doing this shit in 2005. But Vince gets Hogan, immediately puts the belt on him, right? He beats the Iron Sheik in Madison Square Garden. Now Barnett tells Vince, look, I think I could get you the time slot on TBS. And Vince loved it because he knew that if he got that slot, That was like the one thing that was missing, the one piece of the puzzle that was missing. It was the highest rated slot in the country. If he could get that slot, he could take over every territory in the country. Now, the Briscoes, they could see the writing on the wall. They wanted out. They saw this as a sinking ship. Ole ended up meeting with them and convinced them the money is going to come. You just got to wait and be patient. The money is going to come. Just hang in there. And they all made an agreement that if they ever wanted to sell their stock, that they would have to offer it to other board members first. In the episode, Briscoe says Ole made them take a blood oath. The Briscoes, they're still looking to sell, though, after they felt Ole broke the agreement, and Barnett ends up putting them in touch with Vince McMahon. Now, that's a little bit different than what Briscoe told WWE.com years ago. They did their own feature on Black Saturday. And in that interview that the website did with him, he said that they were working for Mid-Atlantic at the time. And they spoke with Vince on the phone. There was no mention here of Barnett having anything to do with, linking them up. According to Briscoe, his brother mentioned that they were looking to sell, and Vince flew them both up to LaGuardia Airport in New York for a secret meeting. It was actually Vince and Linda McMahon both. They were part of that meeting. They met in a boardroom at the airport. Jerry Briscoe told Vince that he could get the controlling interest, from the other shareholders to vote in their favor because a lot of the stockholders were really disgruntled. Nobody was really making any money, not like they used to. Vince wanted at least 51% or he wasn't interested because 51% would give him controlling interest. Ole's son brings up the agreement that they made, that they had to sell to the other stockholders first. And he says that he was assured by the lawyers, Ole was, that would protect him. Obviously, that turned out not to be true. And with some of the stockholders having no idea about any of this, including Ole, the Briscoes, Paul Jones, and Jim Oates, they used their majority voting power to add a bylaw that the company could be sold without informing all shareholders or even allowing them the right to match any outside offer and keep the company. And as soon as that got signed, they sold their stock over to Vince McMahon. Now, Ole's mother dies in March of '84, and he flies to Minnesota to handle the arrangements. While he is there, he gets a call from Louise, the office employee that I mentioned earlier, who they interviewed for this. And she tells Ole, Vince McMahon just walked in and told her that he now owns the company. So Ole and his son, they fly back home immediately. Ole files an injunction to try to stop the sale. And they fought it for a good 3 or 4 months, but ultimately they failed. All it really did was delay the inevitable. And Vince McMahon, the swell guy that he is, he still offered Ole a job. And he told him, hey, it's just business. Then came the fateful meeting. And I don't know if it was Black Saturday or if it was some other date. I don't remember what day it was, if it was at the studio or at the office. But they end up in the same building. Vince tells Ole, I want you to meet my wife, Linda. And Ole has always claimed, he's always maintained that his response was, fuck her and fuck you. And it's Ole Anderson, so I can totally believe that he said that in those exact words, verbatim. And then we get to July 14th, 1984, Black Saturday. Briscoe has said in interviews that Vince brought Gorilla Monsoon with him to the studio that day. I guess just in case things went sideways, like his bodyguard. Georgia fans, they turn on TBS, expecting to see Gordon Solie. Instead, they see Freddie Miller introducing Vince McMahon. There was no studio audience, there were no live matches, but to see Vince McMahon walk into camera frame in front of that backdrop, that studio backdrop that everybody used to see every week on TBS, was surreal. And instead, what he did was, he threw it to taped WWF matches from other parts of the country, and matches that had already aired elsewhere on TV. And the Georgia Championship Wrestling fans were furious. They were not happy about it. They flooded the TBS switchboards with angry phone calls. They wanted their wrestling. That's what they wanted. They didn't want this crap. They didn't want Vince McMahon's WWF. They didn't want his sports entertainment. They wanted their wrestling. And Vince didn't care because he didn't want Georgia Championship Wrestling. He just wanted the time slot. And Jerry Briscoe says he doesn't call it Black Saturday. He calls it Green Saturday because it changed his life and it changed his fortunes forever. Spoken like a good little stooge. Thank you, Mr. McMahon. Always my favorite part of the stooge era of the Attitude Era. Briscoe asking Vince if he wanted coffee. Could I get you some coffee, Mr. McMahon? Hey, look, he got a job out of it for the next 36 years. So I would say he made out pretty well. Briscoe says he was told that Ole put a hit out on him and his brother. Louise, the office worker, doesn't think it's true because Ole would have done the job. He would have been glad to do it himself. He would not outsource the job, I guess, to somebody else, which again, I could believe that. But on .com years ago, in that Black Saturday feature I mentioned where they interviewed Jerry Briscoe, Briscoe told another story. He said that one of their friends that they were working against came up to him and his brother before the show one night and said, hey, look, I was offered $5,000 to break both your legs. And this person didn't do it because he had too much respect for Briscoe and his brother, but he warned them, be careful with whoever you're in the ring with because somebody may have taken them up on that bounty. So Vince ended up having the TBS time slot only for about a year before he gave it up. Now, why would he give it up? He fought so hard to get it. Why would he give it up? Because the ratings were shit. The ratings were terrible, and he thought that Turner was on the verge of canceling the show, which is true, he was. I mean, this is the impression that I've always been under reading all about this stuff because Turner put Mid-South Wrestling on TBS in '85, and it was actually drawing higher ratings than the WWF was. So it's very likely that not only was Turner going to cancel Vince's show, but he would have replaced it with Bill Watts' show. And that would have been a huge black eye to Vince McMahon. So what Vince did was he had Jim Barnett contact Jim Crockett Jr., and he offered him the time slot for $1 million. Crockett took the deal. And so ended Vince McMahon's run on TBS, his short-lived run on TBS, and thus began the long-running feud with Vince McMahon and Ted Turner. And Vince also famously told Jim Crockett that he would make him choke on that $1 million. Now, the story they tell here is that McMahon funded the first WrestleMania with that $1 million. The timeline, though, doesn't really match up. And I think that first WrestleMania happens regardless of any of this. I don't think one had anything to do with the other. But Vince did try to make Crockett's life difficult. I mean, Survivor Series and Royal Rumble, for example, they were created solely as a way to counter-program against Starrcade and Crockett's Bunkhouse Stampede pay-per-view. Vince got the Royal Rumble as a free special on USA Network that same night, just to fuck with him. Barnett, not only did he help broker the $1 million deal for the time slot with Crockett, but he ended up being a pretty key part of promoting the first 3 WrestleManias. He did not work for Vince for very long. It was only a few years, but for the time that he did spend there, he left his mark. He also still had a back channel to Crockett. He thought that he could work both sides. That was a bad move on his part. And it was after WrestleMania 3, Vince called him into his office one day. He fires Barnett, orders him out of the building. Barnett goes home. What does he do? He overdoses on sleeping pills. And he was found, I don't know who found him, but he was found in time. They got him to the hospital. They saved his life. The story is that when he woke up in the hospital, Linda McMahon was sitting by his bedside. But there was no offer to come back to the company. And once he recovered, Barnett ended up going to work for Jim Crockett. Wasn't even a full year later that Crockett sold to Ted Turner. So Barnett, who still stayed on, he ended up working for many years for WCW as well. And even with the WWE again, they invited him back as a consultant. He was still working in that role as a consultant for Vince right up until the very end when he died in 2004. Bruce Pritchard has said that he would speak with Barnett weekly on the phone to get his feedback on the shows. Now imagine 80-year-old Jim Barnett giving them feedback on those Ruthless Aggression era shows. Bruce Pritchard, he even credits Barnett with telling him early on, hey, get behind John Cena, that John Cena kid, that's going to be your guy. He says Barnett was always talking up John Cena there at the beginning. But they ended the episode by leaping forward all the way. I mean, they skipped over, God, how many fucking years? They skipped all the way forward to the Wall Street Journal stories about Vince McMahon from a couple of years ago, him stepping down the first time from the company and then coming back to sell the company. They even included the footage of Mustache Vince when he went on CNBC with Ari Emanuel talking about the sale. And he also said, he talked about how he's made mistakes and he's always taken accountability and owned up to those mistakes. You know, I would say his nose was growing as he said this if his face wasn't so frozen from all the fucking Botox that it physically could not grow. Otherwise, it would have. Bob Roop says that Vince put thousands of wrestlers out of work, and the producer asks about all the wrestlers who became millionaires. And he pauses and he says, well, maybe 3%. The other 97% didn't get to work anymore. I think his math is a little off on that one. Meltzer says it was cable television, not Vince, that killed the territories, and that would have happened with or without Vince McMahon because either Vern Gagne or Bill Watts would have gone national, and they would not have done it as well as Vince did. And they added a postscript at the very end letting us know on January 26th, 2024, Vince McMahon resigned from his role as TKO executive chairman and his position on the board of directors after a former employee filed a lawsuit against him alleging physical and emotional abuse, sexual assault, and sex trafficking. This effectively ended his 55-year run with the WWE. And then, in the final message, they let us know that Alan Robert Rogowski, better known as Ole Anderson, passed away on February 26th, 2024. So how about that? Exactly 1 month after Vince was forced to step down for good and his run came to an end, Ole passed away. As if he held on just long enough to see Vince finally brought down and then he let go. It was not dark in the traditional sense that these Dark Side episodes are. It wasn't about booze, it wasn't about pills or steroids or domestic abuse or the usual stuff that we hear about. It was about backstage politics and business and deception. And I liked that. I thought it was a nice change from the usual. And it really was a turning point in the wrestling business. If you think about what it led to in the war with McMahon and Crockett, and then later on McMahon and Turner. Did Vince McMahon kill the territories? Yes and no. More no than yes, but yes and no. He was not directly responsible for their death. I think Meltzer is right when he says that cable television was always going to be the ultimate end for the territories. Once you open the business up nationally like that, and as the TV universe started to really expand, it would have been very difficult to continue running those territories the way that they were run. And if it wasn't Vince, it would have been somebody else trying to lead the charge. But the way in which Vince went about doing it was ruthless. You know, he hastened their downfall. Absolutely. He did not play nice. He crossed lines that had never been crossed before. He broke sort of these agreements that were understood between territories and between promoters. He didn't care about any of that. Vince had no respect for these people or their territories. He wanted it all to himself. And it didn't matter what he had to do to get there. He would run you over, put the car in reverse, and back up over your corpse if he had to. He is not a heroic figure in this story, just the opposite. But again, it was going to happen regardless. Vince McMahon will go down as the most polarizing figure in the history of the business, and also the most successful to ever do it. And so ends Season 5 of Dark Side of the Ring. I hope you've enjoyed these reviews. These are all archived on YouTube. This one will be archived with the rest of them up on the YouTube channel if you ever want to refer back to them. They're all organized in one Dark Side of the Ring playlist. And now it gets me thinking, you know, every year we talk about will there be another season, and there ends up being another season. If we are to assume there will be a 6th season, and I'm going to say that there will be, if there is a Season 6 of Dark Side of the Ring, what ideas would you like to see? You can leave a comment, shoot me a message, let me know what you think, because I've got my own ideas here. People keep saying, boy, you know, they're running out of ideas. The well is running dry. I don't think so. I disagree. And I think ahead to a possible Season 6, you know what? Some possible topics. Ravishing Rick Rude. Ludwig Borga. Go look that guy up. Tell me he wouldn't be a perfect fit for Dark Side of the Ring. Sweet and sour Larry Sweeney. I'm going to keep pitching his name every year. I'm going to keep pitching his name. Ashley Massaro, especially now in light of, her name was back in the news a few months ago. I think Ashley would be a very sad story to tackle here on this show. Daphne, Hana Kimura. I guess, Hana Kimura, not really so much Dark Side of the Ring, per se. More like Dark Side of reality TV or Dark Side of social media. But she was an up-and-coming star in the wrestling world. And I think there are a lot of people who don't know her story who should. Rock and Roll Buck Zumhofe. Talk about some of the biggest fucking dirtbags in the history of the wrestling business. There's one. The Heroes of Wrestling pay-per-view back in 1999, because they always like to stick 1 or 2 episodes in there like that were a little more lighthearted. I would say Teddy Hart, but they may not want to because Peacock already has a documentary up about him. But, I mean, he could certainly be one potential subject. I mean, look, they can get a whole season's worth of episodes out of Vince McMahon if they wanted to. They love mentioning him so much. They always try to stick a mention of him in every episode. Just do an entire season based around him. So again, I know some people think the well has run dry. There are still more topics to cover. Those are only a few. Those are some of the ones that I would like to see them do. But again, if you have your own ideas, let me know what you think.